I've realized I need to listen more. 25 years being married, and I still realize I need to listen more and talk less. Just in general, even with my kids, listen to what they're saying. So, what do I want, and why do I want it? I want to be the leader. I want to be the guy that everybody calls for their gun ranges. But I need to listen to what people need.
So, welcome to the AFT Construction Podcast. I'm excited to have Nathan Pies on with us today. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so Nathan is a licensed mechanical engineer. You're also with Pioneer Design and Engineering. And we go back a little ways because you've actually designed a gun range for us. And I actually have a couple clients in the process of doing a few more in the near future. So, we'll definitely be in contact. So, I think this was going to be a fun episode to bring you on to speak about gun ranges.
I'm excited. I thought it would be a great opportunity to share what I know and, what I enjoy doing.
Well, it's interesting that, being a licensed mechanical engineer, um, most of us understand, the role you play in our designs, especially in the buildings, and buildings are becoming more complex. And, homes are, mechanical is a huge component of all of our designs, not just from a healthy living standpoint, but also as you think about aesthetically in the house. And then, for us, figuring out how we're going to design a house with trusses, right? And have space and lack of soffits and, access for our mechanical. But I think more importantly, something that maybe few people have the opportunity to build or see our gun ranges. How did this opportunity open up where now you almost have become a specialist in the gun range industry, Nathan?
So I worked for a bigger firm several years ago before I went on my own, and we did some large commercial ranges. And I had a homeowner, it's about 8 to 9 years ago, called me and said, "Hey, I have this space in my basement. I want to be able to shoot guns downstairs." I'm like, my first thought was that'd be fun to do, and then I realized I can scale it. It's big commercial ranges have lots of power, they have lots of space, they have roofs to put stuff on. But as you know, the range that we've done is in the basement. You're trying to find space. That's one of the constraints. So I realized I can scale it down, and it doesn't have to be all the fancy bells and whistles. It needs to move the air, and you don't necessarily need three-phase power. That's one of the things that people freak out about because you're moving a large volume of air, which essentially you're like a commercial unit. But we can choose to use some different phase converters or VFDs to adjust that. So that's kind of how I fell into it. I was able to scale something down. I'm like, okay. Then I got another one a couple months later, and it's just kind of a slow progression. But over the last, say, 3.5 years, 4 years, I've done 30 to 40 gun ranges, including commercial and home. And people are like, people do that, and I'm like, yeah, you'd be surprised the people that do that. And they're like, do people do it here in Arizona where we live? And I'm like, yeah, people do it in Arizona. They're like, okay. So that's kind of how I kind of got into it. And it was a slow progression, as when you're trying to get going on something, it's, the balls, got to get that momentum going. But once that momentum starts going, you add in that mass to keep going. It starts rolling pretty good.
Well, there's something to be said about being known as a specialist too, right? Any of us running a business, ideally, I mean, you have a ton of talent and expertise from the mechanical side. That's your background, and I think it's maybe not always common to have a licensed mechanical engineer doing a gun range, which is really important. I think for those listening, for doing a gun range, make sure they're licensed. Let me ask you this though, maybe before we get into some of the specifics of the residential gun ranges, when you look at municipalities, city ordinances, restrictions, does that vary throughout the US? Does it vary by state? Especially if you've done, 30 to 40 of these. I know in Arizona it's pretty open, but you heard people say, "Oh, can you do that in Scottsdale? I know you can do it in Gilbert." How does that work just municipality for approval, or are there any restrictions, on a national level?
Just blankety, there's not a blanket yes or no. Each municipality is different. I've got ranges going on in New York, and you get in these outlying counties, more rural, there are less restrictions. People are more open to things like that. And a lot of times these municipalities don't know what they're looking at. For instance, the one we did, they didn't know, the city didn't know what they were looking at. So I had to teach them. And then they're like, who's going to certify this? And I'm like, I'll certify it. I'll take responsibility of it. So the simple answer is I usually make a phone call to the plan reviewers, plan examiners. I do that as the engineer. I don't put that on anybody else because at the end of the day, I'm gonna give you the system that's safe. There may be additional restrictions or additional levels of filtration that the city or state wants, but that's on a case by case basis, and that's my fees take care of all that. So I make sure I provide a safe environment for the customers and the users.
It may be hard for you to answer this, but from a municipality, background, what they're worried about. You mentioned filtration. I'd imagine that they're really concerned about the health of someone down there. Proper filtration, especially as you're dealing with, ammunition and discharge, and which I will allow you to expound upon. Do they have any other safety concerns? Are there any other restrictions, as far as access, privacy, and even if it's a residential home? Um, what other pushback items do you get from a city?
The access is usually this. They're worried about safety, about people just random, the random guy trying to get in there on the street. And generally, we have a few that I've done that there's a door right off of you know a garage or a warehouse or something like that. But generally, these are down in basements, or there's a path of layers that you have to get through to get to these, because usually there's a gun room associated with the range. So there's an armory, where homeowner has his collection, and then you go into that next stall. You're in the shooting range, So there are levels, and that's what a lot of cities wanted. They want to know: is it locked? Is it secured? And generally, the answer is yes. And then from a ballistic standpoint, most of these are in concrete. You're 8 to 10 inches of concrete, and if we don't have concrete, we also add ballistic baffles that will, it's AR 500 plate. It ranges between 1/4 inch thick, 5/16 thick, and so it will take a pretty good shot, to prevent any stray bullets, entering the home, because some of these are above sleeping quarters or living areas, so, or below. I'm sorry, I should say. So that's a that's where that generally comes from.
So let me ask you this: when you speak about like the baffles that can be installed for the ballistics, to prevent ricochet or whatever, maybe Kevlar, is that something that's typically installed? I mean, what are you putting on these concrete walls, especially on a long gun range, right, to prevent like any issues from the surrounding areas that are adjacent to the gun range?
So generally, I will look at a plan, and I like to get involved early. As getting planning early, looking ahead, that makes a world of difference. So there's a couple different products. Usually what we line the ranges with, it's concrete or it's CMU, and it's fully grouted. So it's pretty solid, and generally people shoot straight. You get the occasional the stray, but I got a product right here on my desk. It's called Dark Void. It sounds like it's a Star Wars Sith Lord. Um, One of my acoustic, I work with an acoustic engineer to get acoustic materials that can be lined in the range or above the ceiling or in additional walls to, um, you know, protect. You're not really protecting anything. It's more sound dampening to reduce the noise that you hear in those ranges or outside the ranges, I should say.
Yeah, because ideally, I mean, anyone that's in the range and they're shooting, I mean, they should be wearing some soundproof headphones, right? Some sort of
Yep.
instrument to protect their ears, anyways. And so, what you're looking at from an acoustical standpoint, as well as a soundproofing, is just ensuring that that noise isn't, echoing all throughout the home or commercial property.
Correct. Yeah. You want to cut that noise down, and, that goes into some of the equipment as well. You look at, you know, we've been in homes or buildings where you can hear the air handling system and it's loud, and you don't want to, exacerbate that's the right word, I believe, to make that worse. You don't want to add to the noise, before you even start shooting.
Yeah, and that completely makes sense. I mean, for our clients, even outside of a gun range, I mean, a huge impact is like, where are my condensers going to be, right? Where are my air handlers going to be? Am I going to hear them? Are they sitting on the floor? Am I going to feel the vibration? Are they hanging from the ceiling? So we're taking that into consideration on any mechanical design, let alone when you're looking at a gun range. You bring up the armory. What's interesting, most of the gun ranges that I've been involved in or I've seen, it is pretty common that there'll be like a gun safe or armory nearby. The ones I've been through, they've never been in the gun range or typically adjacent, like a separate room. So that it's like a
Yeah.
massive safe or a walk in safe. And then you get in the armory, take out the equipment you need, you go into the gun range. And of course, as you mentioned, there's a door. How are most clients protecting not the armory? Because I think that stands for itself, that it's typically a safe, full body safe entry to the gun range itself, locking mechanisms, is there any requirements from the city just on access to the gun range itself?
The city is never, I've never had a city come and say, you have to put X type of door with this kind of lock hardware. I've not had that. But generally, most of my clients, they are, a higher end client. They want a certain look or aesthetics. And so a lot of my guys, I have several guys, one client has a hidden door. Um, it's it's a looks like a poured concrete wall. You push a button on it, the door swings open, and you go down into the stairs, and you're in the gun range area. So, there's some clever things people do, but a lot of people do the vault door because it looks cool, or I've had one that, if you've seen Ocean's 11, the spinning door with the I had a client that did that. He had
Yeah.
biometrics, and he just thought it was a great idea. And I'm like, I don't have to design that part of the range. I'm glad, because that's way out of my comfort zone to design something like that. But we made it work from a ventilation standpoint. So
And then I want to get to the process because why it's really important to have you in, Nathan. I know the project we were working together last, client was the same, not only just for the gun range itself, but he wanted biometrics access to the house. So any door or window, yeah, not window, but any door or access
yeah,
point, is all biometrics that we were designing. What's funny is you bring up the one of the gun ranges you did many years ago. This is probably 15 years ago before I started AFT. We did a gun range, and it was you walk into this massive library, this incredible library, and it was almost like Mission Impossible. There's one book, right? You pull the one book, and then the whole wall opens up. You go down, and they had this private wine cellar and their armory, of course, safe, and then the gun range. So it is pretty creative how clients will either block or hide that aspect of the home, more for safety, just or maybe it's for just to create like an event as people are coming by and you're giving a tour of the home and showing them kind of some of the neat aspects to the build.
yeah.
So from your side, Nathan, from a process aspect, you mentioned how important it is for you when why should someone, if they're looking at doing a gun range, how early should you be involved and why?
I like to be involved as from in the design process early on in the planning stages. Uh, we, if I can get in early enough, I can start allocating space for not only the range equipment, um, for the backstop. I can work. I work with different manufacturers that have that equipment, but for my air handling equipment and for my fans and controls and ductwork. Sometimes ductwork, like what you talked about earlier, trying to, you not necessarily need to hide the ductwork, but if you have ductwork exposed in the range, you got to protect that ductwork. Now you're adding additional baffles, whereas you can, so you don't shoot through your ductwork. So getting on early on is what we need to do. Be involved in the design phase. Call me up. I usually spend a half hour, 30 minutes with somebody on the phone with the architect or even a homeowner or a builder and say, okay, what are you looking for? How large do you want this range? And this is kind of what the space is. I have some general blocks that I use, say, this is the volume that I need, and this is the area that I need. And then you got to worry about maintenance. That's so as long as you're early on in the stage, you can say, okay, I can get these things in place. But the worst for me is when I get a phone call and say, hey, we're putting a gun range in. I'm like, oh, great. Can you send me the plans? Well, why don't you just come down and look at what we have already installed? So for me, that's, I've had a couple of those and you're like, cringe because people, you don't realize how much air you're moving. I mean, you're moving instead of a regular 5-ton unit, that's 2000 CFM, you're moving up to, one of my home ranges has, it's almost like a commercial range. It moves 20,000 cubic feet per minute of air because it's, over 20 feet wide. And it's like a commercial range. So getting in early can save a lot of issues. And then down the road, I don't have to say, call up Brad and say, "Hey, Brad, the electrician's telling me there's not enough power for my equipment, and you've already called the utility company. They've dropped transformers. You know, we can head this off and we can be ahead of the game and not have to try to backtrack. And planning ahead will save money. Take a little time now. You don't got to come back at that callback. Where it's going to cost you 10 times the amount of money because you didn't take a couple days earlier." So.
I think that's really valuable because even your example of a standard, 2,500 CFM to the 20,000, I mean, that's eight times the size, for that small space. You mentioned the word maintenance. As people are thinking about the potential of putting in a gun range, speak to the maintenance. What kind of maintenance is involved or needed when installing that, not only from a client perspective, but maybe some of myself as the builder?
So generally, depending on where we're at in the country, we do a couple different styles of, we can do there's a fan, basic nuts and bolts. There's a fan and there's sets of filters. And then there's some kind of generally cooling equipment. Some guys don't want heating, cooling, depending where out in the country. Some guys like, I don't care. I'll freeze down there. I'm okay, whatever. But you have couple sets of filters, so you have meters, magna helix that will test the pressure across those fans as they load up and get dirty. So you need to change. You'll have a HEPA filter and a bag filter, and sometimes a pre-filter, depending on how you do it. If that bag filter and that HEPA filter could go, depending on how much you shoot, they're good. They could be good for a year. Sometimes HEPA filters can go longer, but that's why you have that meter across it, so okay, it's time. We're getting a little bit higher on the static, and that fan's working harder. So you want to get that. But the issue with that is you have lead now, right? Or some people shoot lead-free ammo, but there's still a little bit of lead involved in it. So there are companies out there that are industrial hygienists that will come in, and say, okay, for X amount of dollars, and it's based on how much time they think they'll take. They'll come in, pull your filters, switch your filters out, bag in, bag out, take them all out in black bags so you don't have it's not bringing through your house. It's all clean. And then they'll rake depending on the type of trap you have, they'll rake the rubber down, clean out all the lead, and then throw it back up there and put it back to normal, and they'll wipe it down. But that's some of the maintenance that needs to be done. And that could be done annually or every other year, depending on how much you shoot. Because some of the homeowners that I know a couple of guys that I've done the ranges for, they're beautiful ranges. And I go and talk to them and they're like, "Oh, I've shot 6 times in the last 2 years in there." And so it's really on how you use it, and being mindful that it does need to be maintained. It is equipment, and it comes down to safety at the end of the day.
It's funny because you mentioned industrial hygienist, and it's like I think many people listening are like, "Is that even a profession?" But like the funny thing is like you understand the reason why, right? And to be that specialized, how have you built your network, Nathan? As you think about that you're becoming in contact with a company that does the industrial hygienics, right, for a company or for a client, right, to come in because the maintenance is super important, as you mentioned, to come through and clean, depending on usage, of course. But how has that network expanded, especially as you've grown, to have such a staple in this business?
So I started out, I went and, there's a big gun conference in Las Vegas every year. It's called SHOT Show. It's usually in Vegas, same time as the Concrete Expo.
Yep.
So I run across guys, that do concrete for ranges, and they come, get them a pass. So I started out going and talking to a couple guys like, "Hey, I'm an engineer. I've done some gun ranges. How can I help you?" "Oh, we got somebody. We got somebody." So I had to, it took a couple years for me to get in the door with some of these bigger some of these range manufacturers. And I just finally, in the last, like right before COVID, I got in with one of my guys I do a lot of work with. They are Mobile Range Technology. They take shipping containers and make gun ranges out of shipping containers. So that's always another option for people. But Scott, great guy, gave me a chance. He said, "Hey, I need an engineer." So Scott and I have been doing stuff all over the country, and we got stuff going all over the world right now. And from that, I met filter guys. I've met, gun range, like gun manufacturers, and like, "Hey, we got a range. Would you like to look at it?" And gun range owners. So I've started, I make the ask. I've reached out and say, "Hey, the worst they can tell me is no." So my dad was a salesman, and he said the worst somebody can tell you is no. So I said, okay, I'm just going to ask the question. Hey, can I come look at your range? Can I come talk to you about your ranges? What I can do for you? What service can I provide to you to make sure you have the safest range in the gun range industry?
I think that's really important to understand is that when people are introducing you, of course, you're a licensed mechanical engineer, as you mentioned, but the variation in knowledge you have of range manufacturers, how does that work hand in hand? How do you specify a certain range depending on the client to know exactly what would be the best manufacturer to fit their need or the project itself?
So recently, I've gone through some business changes in the way I do things. I've realized I need to listen more, what people need.
I
Um,
think we all need to do that.
right? I surprisingly enough, and you know, I've been, coming up. We're 25 years being married, and I still realize I need to listen more and talk less. Just in general, even with my kids, listen to what they're saying. So in the last, you know, I like to say I've been doing this the whole time, but it's not true. I'd be lying. In the last few months, I'm like, okay, what do I want? Why and why do I want it? I want to be the leader. I want to be the guy that everybody calls for their gun ranges. But I need to listen to what people need. Not what I think they want. I don't need to be the guy that says, okay, no, I'm going to tell you what you want. It's like when you go buy a car, you know what you want when you go look for your truck. This is what I want in my truck. And then the salesman brings you something else. That's not what I asked for. So I need to, the key for me is to listen to what my clients want. Because there's some guys that just want, I have one guy that wants to bury a Connex in the desert and just wants to move air through it. I'm like, okay, this is and I'll tell him the downfalls of it, but I'll say, okay, I'm happy to design it for you, but this is the downfalls, and I'll educate him on, this is what's going on. He goes, nope, that's what I want. So I listened to what he wanted, and then I gave him what he wanted. So I think listening is the key.
So, and I think that's good value for any of us. I know that that can be one of my issues is that I tend to talk too much. Listening is definitely a learned art. There's training. I had a guest on, Oscar Trimboli, a few episodes ago, and he was really big on that. That the art of listening and how valuable it could be for your business and make us all more profitable and build quicker, and all the things that you and I are trying to do. From anyone that's looking at not just the manufacturing options, the range. What types of ranges are there? We've been speaking about the basement. You mentioned even a shipping container. For someone that depending on again, there's gonna be limitations like if you're in Manhattan or something. But for most people looking at different options, what are those?
So generally, there's three basic options that I like. There's the purge system, which is air in, air out. No energy recovery, no recirculation. And that next step is, you recirculate that. You bleed off some exhaust and you run it through all the HEPA filters. Then it goes back through an air handling system, or, if you're just circulating, if you're in a mild climate, some people don't, they just want to move air. They just want to keep that air going. And you can do it that way. And then there's, you get a little more advanced, you go into energy recovery. Of course, that adds cost, so you're now recovering that energy. You're doing an energy transfer, and that works in climates that are a little more extreme, like here in Arizona, or say like in Minnesota, where you get winter, get a hot extreme or a cold extreme. So those are good options if you want to save some money, but the first cost will be an impact. So, those are the type of ranges that from an HVAC standpoint, that you have. And
So looking at just the mechanical aspect, to give a point of reference, of course, I know there's so many variations, but if someone's looking at doing an ERV as opposed to some of the other examples you gave, you know, what does that look like? 1X, 2X? I mean, how does that change just the mechanical design alone?
that adding the ERV I would say it's a 2x cost. So from not only just from an equipment standpoint, now you have and power standpoint as well. There's other thing controls associated with that. So it's a 2x cost. Um, that's not always the case, but safely that's a safe number to say you're gonna double your cost to add the energy recovery. And is
And
it worth it?
yeah, is it worth it? And I think this is really important as you look at the gun ranges you've done over the years. Um, of course, there's not a standard size, there's not a standard layout. It varies. However, most gun ranges, just for people that want to have a good idea, maybe the minimum they need, and then of course it can vary. But typical gun ranges that you're designing, what does that look like from a size perspective?
So I found a sweet spot. There's been a sweet spot lately, and it's running about 8,000 CFM. So we're running. That's about you know 10 feet wide, somewhere in that ballpark. On that range, and then a lot of times what we're doing, instead of putting a big air handler on top or to cool it, we're bringing in fresh air, but we're using mini splits to temper that air inside that range, because you're not bleeding off a ton of air in that. Those mini splits are amazing. They can ramp up and match speed. They have digital compressors that will ramp up and be able to cool or back it off if it doesn't need as much cooling. So, you know, and that box looks like it's, if you just do the fan and filters all in one, which I prefer to do right now. I used to do a lot of separate components put together. It's one package. It's about 108 inches long, you know, 2 feet tall, and about it can be about 60 inches wide. So it's not a small piece of equipment, but the alternative is to have a separate filter housing, transition, and ductwork to a fan. So now you're adding length. You're making that, instead of 108, you're making it 16 to 20 feet long. So then now you're like, where do I put this? And you want to, and hanging it from the ceilings is not usually the best option. You want to drop it down on the ground if you can, because that's, then you don't have to get structural involved as much. And so,
So from and understanding, the 8,000 CFM, but from a maybe from a linear measurement, you're looking at roughly 10 feet wide by 20 feet deep. Is that right, or is it 50 feet deep? I mean, what's the minimum like
so
length for?
on the range, what you're looking for is it's your cross section. You want the air to move across the shooter, at between 50 and 75 feet per minute. So really, what you look at is the width of the range and the height of the range, and the length. You know, if it gets too long, you may have some issues. You got to add some static to make sure you get that range moved down. But as you know, you put that fan in place and you got the CFM calculated, you're going across, 10 by 8, so you're 80, square feet. You're moving that air. And as we go through, to make sure that shooter, you're trying to draw that lead and that smoke down range. So that's what the depth of the range has some aspects on the heating and cooling, but as for airflow, it's the cross sectional area that really drives that volume. And on some of our ranges, we have these large ceilings. It's great. I love people give me, you know, some of these basements I've had 14 feet of space to work with, but the shooting stall is only 8 feet. So what you do is you slope that ceiling right at that shooting stall, because then then you can force that air and you keep that air volume down, and you can get it past the shooter, and then it can flare out whatever it does downrange. So you want to neck that down so you can keep that velocity as high as possible without having to oversize based on a giant cross section area.
It's interesting here you break it down the way, because I think most of us think, oh, you just go build the space and you move forward, throw a mini split or, the mechanical down there. But there's a lot more science to this that's really important to understand. As you've been breaking down here in the last few minutes, Nathan. Maybe educate the audience a little bit as far as like MERV 8 filters, bag filters, HEPA. Some of us have heard those terms. Some may not be as savvy as what those mean. You mentioned ERV, right? The energy recovery ventilation. Um, the difference in MERV 8 as opposed to HEPA and bag filters.
So the MERV 8 is something most people have in their home. Like that's what you have in your standard. It's a pretty common filter you have in your air handler in your home. So it's that pleated, 1 inch, 2 inch, sometimes a 4 inch that you put inside of your furnace section. The bag filter is designed to catch more particulates, just chunks. Sometimes we get rid of the MERV 8 and use the bag to catch the chunks, depending on how much the shooter is going to shoot. And then if they're worried about cost, we, put that pre-filter, and that catches some of the stuff, but the bag filter is there to catch a lot of that debris, and that still has a high level. That could be a MERV 17, which is, the amount of microns that can get through it. But that HEPA filter, generally these are like healthcare grade HEPA filters, 99.9, which means it's catching almost everything. Your air is going to be cleaner than what you're breathing outside. So, but those are, they're 24 inches deep. The bag filters are 26 inches deep. So, you have, that's where your length is coming from on your air handler. So that air filter is, and from a cost standpoint, you're looking at, your typical throwaway MERV 8 is like, say, $13. And I think bags run like 150, and then HEPAs are $300 a piece. And some of these air handlers some of these small ones have two sets, so when you're changing out filters, you're over usually $1,000, but if you're shooting, you know, quite regularly, you're changing it out once a year, something like that. Or if you're not shooting as much, every 2 years, and filters here in the desert, we don't usually have to worry about mold and mildew. Generally we're pretty dry unless we have some catastrophic issue, some weird monsoon thing that happens and we flood a basement and we don't find that water leak. Other parts of the country, Florida, you know, I've done a home range in Florida that, I gotta dry out the air. So there's different things I do before I even filter that air, because you're bringing in all that nice, hot, humid air, and mold and mildew and all those spores love that hot, humid air, and they just hang out there. And that's a whole nother issue that we don't want to have in a home, let alone a gun range. So, you know, where you're at in the country will really affect some of the things I do as an engineer.
Yeah, it's really important to think about that, whether you're, adding humidity, removing humidity, right? And trying to control any microbes, as you mentioned, that'll go in there. Um, from just the heating and conditioning itself, um, are people putting in fans? Is that something that people are doing down there? Uh, is that common? I know you had mentioned that that could be a thing, depending on a combination fan, inline fan, or so forth.
So usually it's an inline fan with the filters. That's what most people are, on the gun range. That's what I'm recommending right now. And some of them I will put in, like I said, the mini splits. But having other fans down there will mess with your airflow. If you try to put, like, some guys want to put, I've had guys ask if can I put a ceiling fan in there so I can keep air moving? And I tell them I do not recommend that, because you get weird. Your air will not flow laminar. You won't get this nice flow. And when the shooter is, you'll get these air. You do a smoke test. I've done a couple smoke tests, and I'm like, the air is doing weird eddies and, spinning around. And I look at these plans and I'm like, oh, you guys added a hole back here. I got a notch, and so my air, you know, is doing weird things because you didn't follow the plans. You thought it'd be okay to change it. Nobody said anything to me. So that's frustrating to me. And, I think you and I had this discussion there, and we want to keep that square, rectangle. You don't want to keep that nice back end square, because you start adding elbows and stuff like that back there on the room, air's not going to flow the way it should.
Yeah, it's really good advice. You mentioned power in the very beginning. That a lot of people have the misconception they need three-phase power. Um, Typically, just from a power perspective, what is needed for a gun range, in addition to just the mechanical equipment that's installed?
Kind of the rule of thumb I'm using, if we do some of the homes, some of these bigger homes, people do bring in three-phase power, but it's not commercial three-phase power. It's residential. It's 240 high lag delta, so you know it's a little bit different. But I usually I like to tell them 100 amps, just to be safe. um Not knowing, what the fan's going to do, up front, because once I get a design and I can clarify that and get it all cleaned up. But you know I don't tend to do, I'll do some consultation up front, early on. Here's a little bit of my time, and then if you want to get farther into it, okay, here's a contract. Let's detail this out. Um, but yeah, you want to make sure you can say, if they're trying to figure out, okay, do I bring in a 600 amp service, or do I need to bring in eight, or, is 400 enough, depending on, this is like a man cave house. I got all gun range and a bedroom, So it's kind of depends on what you're looking for. But 100 amps is. I've not had a residential one that's gone over 100 amps. I've had close, because of things that were done, and I had to, you know, call an audible on a fan. Hey, you put the wrong size ductwork in. Oh, we thought it would be okay. So, oh, now you have to, instead of a 10 horsepower motor, we have to go to a 20 horsepower motor. And you know, that's why early on conversations can save headaches down the road.
Yeah, it's really sound advice. It's interesting that it's only 100 amps. I mean, it's not a whole lot. When you compare it to swimming pool or even, as much as like electric, heaters on a back patio. And now with the LED technology, and a lot of lighting and stuff, it's limited the load factor a lot of us need. And so based on the experience you've had putting gun ranges, have you seen or had any clients or customers have an experience where they didn't have sufficient power, they didn't have 100 amps, or has it been pretty easy to work around that?
I haven't had that come up specifically, but it's always a concern because some of these, homes are farther out, and they're limited in what comes in. So, a couple things we can do is look at reducing, the static on the motor. So a little bit bigger ductwork we can reduce. By reducing the static, you reduce the load on the motor. It's not a ton you can take off, but I mean, if you're on the line of, say, oh, we're at like 7.5, if we reduce it a little bit, we can go to a 7.5 ton, not have to jump to the 10. So there is savings there. So, and it's really a case by case basis, like you said earlier. I have not been able to duplicate. I have not been able to take the same plan and just say, oh yeah, here's your range. I've had people ask, and I'm like, every range is different. Every scenario is different. That's the beauty about custom homes, because they are custom, and gun ranges are custom. Clients are custom. I can't imagine you've had the same client opportunity experience with every one of your clients. I would imagine it's different with everybody.
I wish I did. It would make it a little bit easier, right?
Yeah.
So how does that factor in without, of course, giving away what your cost is? How does that figure when you're involved and they're initiating the process with you? Again, it's case by case. You can't take and I would say most of the projects we're working on, even from an architectural perspective and design, they may have a client that has seen previous work that they've had. They may like it. Um, there's bits and pieces maybe they can use as inspiration, but they're never going to be able to take that exact design and plop it in for the new client. So there's always going to be this handling, of that relationship. For you, as you're looking at quoting a project, um, how does that play a role, knowing that, hey, even though you have a great understanding of how to design and build a gun range and the resources available, there's still an aspect to figure out, okay, temperature of the client, are there any red flags? I'm sure you have to identify those with your clients as well as same as I do.
Yeah.
How do you assess a situation to give you a good context so you can know how much, cost or VE is going to be involved?
So that's a great question. I've had this discussion with a couple of my range guys, with a couple of the range manufacturers. So what's great is some of these guys, before they come, they'll send them to me or I'll go to them, but they'll vet some of them, because they'll say, are you, people say, oh, I want to do a gun range, and you won't hear from them ever again.
Yeah,
you
right.
know and you've given them a bunch of time, and you're like, I just wasted hours and hours when I could be working on something else. So there are clients, if you have a conversation with somebody, you've probably had the same experience, that you get this feeling that you're like, okay, this person's serious. This person, you know okay, this person, you need to charge more money. This person's going to be the I'm going to say problem child, but they're going to need more hand holding going down the road, because you can tell by some of the questions they ask. What is, when they start asking for the detail, the color of the ductwork, and what color is the VFD, what is the controls, what color are the controls, and stuff like that. You're like, okay, I know I need to spend more time with you. I'm going to charge you accordingly, and then I'll put that in my fee and say, okay, this is what it costs, and I'll say, this covers me X number of meetings. This covers me coming out to the site if I need to. Um, so I just detailed out kind of what my gut says, and I've realized, as you go through this, you're like, you get that vibe, like, I need something's not right here. I've had guys that said, no, I can't take this on right now. I've had a couple I've done that too. And I'm like, "Ah, but I want to do, but I'm like, I got to get past that. I want to do all these gun ranges, but sometimes I can't do them all. And then sometimes I'm glad I don't do some of them all, cause it's, you look at what happens, you find out what happened down the road. I'm like, oh, I'm glad I was not involved in that, cause that was a mess, and I'm glad I saw that coming.
Funny because sometimes the ones you say no to are actually the best ones, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Now, let me ask you this from a cost perspective. As you think about, and again, it's probably hard to quote exactly because there's building costs involved and other things.
Yeah.
But if someone's doing a gun range, maybe at minimum a budget they should be thinking about up to X. It could be X to Y. Just a range of what the cost would be to put one in.
So from a mechanical standpoint, I've got that relatively down. We can get most of the equipment. You're looking at between 50 and 80 for the ductwork, ventilation, AC, just for the basic, get that down. And you can scale up from there. You can go crazy if you wanted to. And then depending on what you do with your range, I mean, you know, you could go super high end. I mean, you can get all the bells and whistles like the one we did. We have all the bells and whistles on that range. I mean, you know, we're shooting a 50 cal in the range,
Mhm.
so that's a 50 BMG. So, it's really on, from a system standpoint, you could go really basic. You could go the hand target, you reel it out, you put a wheel on it and you reel it out and you're shooting, and then you're shooting back against rubber blocks. The rubber blocks are relatively inexpensive, you're 20 to $30,000 for the rubber blocks, backstop, you can do that for that, but you can get all the way up to $250,000 on, you know, rubber berms with all the controls interlocked with the HVAC. Do we want to tie it into the Crestron system? What do we want to control? How much do you want to control? And then that also for me, I love being able to control all this stuff through Crestron and all the, home automation. But for me, that also adds failure points. You know, if it's not working, I might got to get a phone call saying, Nathan, my gun range isn't working. What's going on? And you come to find out that the relay between the Crestron system and the VFD fried and they don't talk anymore. So, that's, so, if somebody for a basic range, you could spend $80,000 on ventilation and then another 80, you could spend easy $80,000 on the trap and targeting systems and go up from there if you wanted to.
So essentially, as you mentioned, I mean, you're 160 plus. Of course, the structure comes into play, especially if you're doing a basement, right? You have to factor
Yeah.
in that space. And I know the one you and I worked on, yeah, that was the bells and whistles. And maybe this is important. Are there any limitations to what you can shoot and what you can, the complexity of the gun range design? You brought up that the client you and I had, he was adamant he wanted a 50 caliber. So, length and design was a huge component of what you were doing, Nathan. To what level is the max, I should say, that you could design that gun range?
It's really, what does a client want? We can design to whatever they want, but it's how much are they willing to spend? Then that comes down to are they willing to spend the money? Because if you have that kind of gun, you wouldn't want it on a 25-foot range. You wouldn't want it on pistol range. So the range we did, I think we're over 100,
Yeah,
100
100
feet,
feet.
over 100 feet. So that's a good distance to shoot. Um, but it comes down to, are they willing to spend the money? Do they want to spend the money? Because you and I know here in Arizona, basements aren't necessarily a common thing, and the ground is super hard. So it's there's a huge expense before you even put the range equipment in. So you know that's where being early on and say, do you really want this? I mean, we're happy. I'm happy to design ranges for anybody, but at the end of the day, I don't want somebody to go, oh, I shouldn't have. I'm spending all this money for something, and I'm like, am I not happy with it at the end of the day? Even that buyer's remorse, and I love doing ranges, but we have to. I want to be realistic with the users, so they don't go, oh, I thought I could just do it for 50 grand and be out the door and be done. You know, that's not the case. There is significant cost involved in that.
Well, I'd imagine how early on are you having the budget conversation? The reason I say that is because for me, I especially later in my career, now I tend to have that budget conversation early because you have to make sure that for both parties, right, to have a clear expectation of what the job's going to cost or the project. So from your side, I'd imagine that budget conversation coming really early just to understand if it's a real player involved or as well as, is the budget realistic and am I designing, something that's going to just be a budget bust?
So yeah, we all have expectations are not necessarily the best. If people go into a situation having expectations that something's happening, you got to have some kind of agreement. Hey, I agree to provide this service to you, but this on your end, you need to realize this is the investment that you will be making. You have that agreement. I like to have it early on, like you said, because I've realized you confront those things up front, and it's not confronting in the bad sense, but it's open discussion saying, this is what it's going to cost you to do this. You know, please, look at this. I'm not, either way, I'm okay either way, whatever you decide. But I want to be honest with you so you know what you're getting into. Because I don't want anybody to come back and say, well, Nathan didn't say, or, he didn't tell me that it's going to cost $80,000 and then I have to change filters, you know, and, there's no magic, there's no magic ductwork fairy that comes and switches out your diffusers for you and cleans everything for you. So, yeah, I like to have that discussion early because I think it benefits everybody. Because if you, as the home builder, are building a home, you have a budget that you're trying to keep in a line. And if I come out here, you know, 6 months after you've broken ground and say, oh, by the way, this is what this is going to cost. You have to go now. You have to go back to your user, homeowner, client and say, oh, I need more money. We got to go back to the bank, which to me is not fair. If we have that discussion early on, it saves a lot of headaches, a lot of irritation. It may not be comfortable to have that discussion up front, but it's better to have it and get it done and get it out of the way.
Yeah, I totally agree. That it was interesting that you brought up just the training and maintenance side. From a training side, with all these designs, how do you do that handoff, that baton handoff? When it's done and executed, moved in, are you actually traveling to these locations and giving them training, or is it all remote?
I've done both. I put a line item in the contract, say, hey, do you want me to come out meet with you? And a lot of these guys are like, I work with a lot of times I'll work with a local HVAC guy and I kind of vet them. I call my vendors and say, okay, I need the guys that you will work with because my vendors are not going to give me guys that they don't want to work with because they don't want the headaches because they're not going to give me the headache guys. So, I have a discussion and I've got a sequence of operations of okay, this is how this should work, and it changes depending on what kind of range equipment you have. If you bring in a couple, guys that say, oh, I can integrate everything, a lot of times they will take over the additional training. We'll do the basic training on the filter change out, recommend these things, how to read your gauges. But then the targeting guys are coming in and saying, okay, you can change your temperature through these control sequences. You're controlling through our iPad or, through a PC or whatever they're using for their interface. But yeah, that's I loved the training. I think I realized I've talking to some commercial, we're talking about homes, but commercially, I've realized that these commercial guys, they want training, and that's something I'm expanding with right now. I spent some time in New Mexico looking at a commercial range, and because they wanted some more training and some, to improve some things. So I realized that's a need that I can fill. People want to have training. They want their people to be educated on what's going on in their system because, education solves a lot of issues. If people are educated, you can solve a lot of issues. You're not playing the guessing game. You're like, oh, okay, this is what's going on. The system's doing this. The filters are probably getting clogged up. We need to go check them. So, education's key.
It's funny. I think education's key for all that stuff, right? And never to like disparage any of our clients or customers. There's no doubt that there is a different experience. And I'm sure it's the same for you, Nathan, when you're working with a highly qualified mechanical contractor, when you're working with a highly qualified builder, architect, it's going to be a much more seamless process, especially if they've done gun ranges in the past. Same for me. If I'm working for a client that's built homes in the past, part of it's education, part of it's you don't know what you don't know, part of it's setting expectation. I mean, there's a whole plethora of items that go into that. But the more that the client or customer knows, I'm sure the experience is a lot better for you.
Absolutely. I mean, and these educated people, clients that are educated that know what they want or they've done it before, like you said, that is a huge talking point because, hey, I did this in my previous house. This worked. It's just generally from a mechanical standpoint. I did this in my previous house. This worked well, or I absolutely hated the way this worked. I don't want this in my new house. So I'm sure you hear that, when you're dealing with your clients and what works, what doesn't work. That's always the best for me, knowing, and that comes back to that listening thing. What are they telling me? You know, what am I hearing? What are they telling me? And then try to iterate back to them. Okay, what I'm hearing you say is you need more training, or you want more training, or more education.
Yeah. So what keeps you up at night?
Oh, what keeps me up at night? Oh, well, it used to be the new dogs we got. Um,
What did you do? What kind of dogs did you get?
we got we got two cockapoos about a year ago, and I'm like, I'll never get a dog. Then we got one, and we're like, oh, he needs a friend, and I'm like, so now we have two dogs, and the dogs, I'm like, oh, they're so. I love the dogs. I don't know. I had dogs when I was a kid, but what keeps me at night is, am I doing the right thing? What is my why? Why am I going after this stuff? Do I, why does it matter to me? And I think what matters to me is I love being an engineer. At the end of the day, I love being an engineer. I've wanted to be an engineer and be in this industry from when I wanted to be an architect. I'm glad I didn't go that road. No offense to the architects that are listening, but that's just not, I realized that's not the road I wanted to go. Engineering, and then I was working at a firm where I didn't get to interact with people. I like interacting with people. I like talking to people. I like solving their issues, solving their problems, and being, you know, the solution for them. Say, hey, call Nathan. He knows what to do. And so my why is, am I doing enough or can I do more? That's what keeps me up is, and then, you know, as a dad, I mean, that keeps me up, from am I teaching that next generation, you know, you just to be good people. I know that's not related to what's going on here, but I think that's what keeps me up. Am I being the best dad that I can be? Am I being the best husband I can be? you know I think those are things that keep me up at night. I try to exercise more now, so that helps with sleep. You're a little tired, but I enjoy what I do. I love, you know general engineering. I enjoy, custom homes. um a niche with, or niche, I don't know if the right word to say, a niche, whatever, you depending on the commercial you look at. Gun ranges is a great group of people. The industry is fantastic. I've made a ton of friends, in the industry, and I want to share what I've learned. And, I'm licensed in 46 states. By the end of the year, I'll have all 50 states and DC and Puerto Rico and Guam. So we're we're moving forward.
I think that's awesome. I did see that in your notes that you're going to be in all 50 states, including Guam and Puerto Rico. How valuable, for anyone that's looking for a resource. Nathan's right here. Um, Going back to your why, I think it's interesting. You mentioned, just trying to be a good person. I think there's a lot of value to that, right? Someone that's, focused on that on their why and understanding what motivates you, not just from a mechanical engineer, but on a personal level. It reflects in the quality of work you're producing. It shows in the network you're building, right? The people that you're inspiring or working with. I think there's a lot of value to people, and that I do love that there is a huge push, especially in our industry, of people looking to educate and to collaborate, right? Which is what you're doing, Nathan. I know that's part of the reason you want to come on is to educate the public, and there's value to that for those listening and for all of us.
Absolutely, I appreciate it. Yeah, education I think is key for anything, and moving the industry and learning from each other. I think I've sent you text messages, just around, hey Brad, I saw this thing, are you guys using this? Just things that I see as you build a home. I'm like, and as I watch, the Instagram stories, I'm like, oh, this is cool, and then, okay, how could I use this, or how can I bring this up to an architect that I'm working with? Where can we bring this together so we can build a better, healthier, safe product for the clients? I think that's, as an engineer, my responsibility is to keep the public safe. Public safety is like the number one canon for engineering, the health and wellness of the public.
So what do you do for fun? Are you a good shot?
I'm going to tell you, my wife's actually a better shot than me. So Danielle's a better shot, but I enjoy going shooting. I enjoy scuba diving. I recently, you know, went to some training and going back to the gym again. Trying to focus on a couple, get my body, back in shape. Taking care of myself. I think as we get older, it's not easier, but you have to do it. I think you just get up, go to the gym, and then we enjoy traveling. I think we've had that discussion. You know, but I enjoy spending time with my family. I realize as I get older, I don't want much. There's not much I want or need, but time and memories. Those are the things that I want with my family. And my kids are getting older, and you know, they still like me, so we're good. They're getting to that teenage age, and where the kids, get a little pushback. But you know, spending time with my family is like, I realize how important it is. I kind of put work. I try to make work was a priority. I'm focused on work. I got to work. I got to work. Got to work. And I realized that I need to invest in my family, invest in my relationship with my wife, and invest in you know what I do, and educating myself and going to these conferences and spending time with industry, but then come home to my wife and my family and invest in them as well.
It's amazing counsel. I can't think of a better way to close, Nathan, because you summed it up perfectly. And I just think there's a lot of sound advice in there, and I think just the value of time, right, and using that time wisely, with those that are important to you around you. For those listening that are looking to reach out to Nathan on their next gun range install or opportunity, where can they find you?
So I'm working on a brand new Instagram and website to specialize in gun range. My base email is nathan.pies. Oh no, let's give me the other. Let's give the other email. Let's go npies at pioneerde.com. And soon there will be a new website. It will be gunrangepde.com, which that's in the process right now. And I'll send Brad that information so you can post that with the podcast.
Yeah, we'll get that all uploaded on the website. So, Nathan, I can't thank you enough. It's been great working with you just in business. It's been great having you on the podcast, and of course, educating our clients and those listening just on something that's a little unique. Putting a gun range in your personal house.
Yeah, awesome, Brad. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
If you get value from the show, please support us by giving a 5-star rating and review on whatever platform you listen to. And I also have a favor to ask. We've had some incredible guests that come on and share their wisdom, their knowledge about their business. So if you have friends or family members that could benefit from those episodes, please share it with them, as well as any other business owners that you're networking with that could get value from the podcast or certain episodes. Please share those as well. Again, subscribe, make sure you're following. Any questions that you have, topics. We've had listeners reach out about certain guests that we should have on the show. Again, brad.l@aftconstruction.com. Email me for topics to address, guests that we should have on, and even if you think you'd be a great guest for the show. So again, thank you for all your support, and we'll see you next time.